You don't have to.
So that we can talk
Come on,
about,
Palomino.
as you guys know, we're having nationals here tomorrow. Mikey's also been on the standards committee, so he is the perfect person to talk about Palominos, a breed that I love very much. Go ahead, Mike.
Okay. So for this one, I don't really have a PowerPoint. Stacy asked me to fill in for an extra spot here and said, well, Palomino Nationals are here. Let's talk about Palominos. And I didn't really feel right going and asking for rabbits or searching the internet to find steel pictures for, because I'm supposed to judge at least part of them tomorrow, and that just doesn't look good to be snooping around for rabbits. But I did end up with a rabbit, but I was completely prepared to do it without.
But you're doing open house. So
And this
you
is
have,
okay.
Yes, so
Okay.
you have a year.
See, I didn't know that until just this very moment.
so
I knew
you're
I was
good.
doing some of them.
You're
All right. So what I did is I just went through my standard and I marked a couple of things that I wanted to kind of talk about, point out on these rabbits. And I'm just going in order of the standard here, not in order of necessarily importance of what these things mean. First off, check those weights. All of our commercial 6-class rabbits, Palominos, Californians, Satins, they're all in the same basic range, but they do have some slight differences from one to the next. And Palominos especially are golden senior bucks. Golden senior bucks, you will find some very nice, really typey, really well balanced that are just right on the line of that 8 pounds. So it's always a good thing to keep that in mind. The next thing is our high point. This is something, to me, this is as much of a distinguishing characteristic of this breed as is the beautiful colors that we have in the breed. So what it says, I usually tell people that the high point's at the front of the hip rather than the center, but actually what the standard says, we want to be correct with the standard, high point is to be even with the back of the toes when the rabbit is posed properly. Now we know where those toes go, and it goes up with the front of the hip. But so talking back to posing again, we've really got to have that proper pose, those rabbits set right, and those toes where they belong, so that we can correctly evaluate where that high point should be. That high point being in a different spot obviously is going to change the top line of the rabbit. We're not going to have quite as much depth in our hindquarter as we do on the rabbits. Obviously, if that high point kept going further back, we'd have more depth over the hindquarter. But that does not mean they are flat over the hindquarters, they slide off, they chop. We still want a well-rounded, deep hindquarter to them, just bringing that high point a little bit further up. And these guys, don't be afraid to talk about the high point being too far forward still, because I see a lot of them that, I'll kind of fix a pose here, that'll actually kind of peek at the back of the rib cage even, come up too far to it. Just because it's further forward than most of our commercial breeds doesn't mean it comes all the way up and gives us that sliding off appearance to the hindquarter.
How would you evaluate that one's top line and placement of high point?
I would say it's high point maybe just a tick far forward, but the overall depth is lacking. So not too far off on the actual placement of that high point, but not high enough to it. Let's see. Point 3. This is something I found very interesting. I don't really know if I'd noticed this part in the standard. I raised Palominos for many years. So if we look at our points, we've got general type as 55 points. We don't break it down any further than that. And the thing that I found interesting is here under faults, it says cut severely for heavy bone, which is kind of interesting because it doesn't say cut severely anywhere else in the type faults. And so, obviously I wouldn't just knock them to pieces because they have that super heavy bone, but you can justify taking a pretty big cut if it's listed with general type and there's 55 points there. Very interesting on that, and I think there's probably 2 reasons that is in there. One is, especially on the Goldens, we had a big problem with crossbred New Zealands. We were getting too dark a red, we were getting really heavier boned rabbits, because New Zealands, these guys are going at 8 pounds on their minimum. New Zealands are a pound heavier on the bucks, and a pound heavier on the does as well. So that extra bone kind of correlates with that. So that's probably one reason. And the other reason is tying back to my meat pen conversation, I won't go into that, or Alan will pick on me more.
I wasn't picking on you. I knew you were gonna say
But
that.
again, we don't want super heavy bone on these. We want enough bone to carry the size of rabbit that we're going for. So that's just a kind of an interesting little thing, and I think it's even more interesting that it says cut severely for that. So we've got a flyback coat, and I'm not gonna. You can read the fur standard in the front for yourselves. I'm not going to overanalyze that, but it's only 15 points. But that's one of those things where that 15 points counts a whole lot more than what it's actually showing us, because right after that we see that color is 25. And if we've got an unfinished, uneven coat, that color is not going to show off for us as well. So do comment on the coats. Do make sure we're aiming the breeders in the right direction, because with those nice crisp finished coats, we show off the color, the paramount feature of this breed, all the better. So now we'll get into the color. Interesting enough, this was our first variety of Palomino. The Lynx came first, and we called it Fawn back then, which was honestly and truly probably a better name for it. But here we are. And they were called the Washingtonian. That was their original name. I'm glad they changed that part, at least. Palomino is a much prettier name. One thing I'll mention before we get into talking about the description of color, mismatched toenails. Check it. It's not a super common thing, but it's not super rare either. If I judge a really big class of Palominos, like I guess I'm going to do tomorrow, I would be surprised if I didn't find any. I'd feel like I maybe missed something if I didn't catch at least one or two in a decent-sized class that had some mismatched toenails to them. So talking about our golden, we'll have to use our imagination, but we will talk about it. Bright golden orange color to it. Glossy is used in that terminology. Like I said, when I started in Palominos, we had a lot of problem with brassy red-colored rabbits that really more approached the New Zealand. And again, when we look at these faults in the standard, it's interesting that we say cut severely for dark brassy red or reddish surface color, but then just a regular cut for pasty, flat, dull color, that more washed out color. So if we've got two rabbits that are fairly equal, we judge by the standard. If we've got one that's red, one that's a little washed out, we want to go toward that washed out. Obviously in the middle is where we want, but all things equal, the red one should be faulted more severely. Lynx, which we've got here, this is a color that there's a lot of debate, there's a lot of misunderstanding about it. We see lynx on every other breed of rabbit, and we find a true agouti pattern. We blow into that coat, we've got really distinct, crisp rings, or at least aiming for that anyway. But this is not the case for a Lynx Palomino. A Lynx Palomino really is a fawn. I mean, we've got, when we blow into it, we do have intermediate color, and the standard does address that. What I think is the key word in that first part of that description is so we talk about the surface color, medium pearl gray, which blends to a dilute beige intermediate color. It's not a true ring, it's blending down into that intermediate color. And that's where I think the big distinction as far as reading that standard comes from. And if we go into this understanding that they're not a agouti animal, but there is intermediate, there is a transitional color before we get to that off-white, white base color, then I think we'll do a little bit better. As far as surface color, in this poor lighting, this rabbit looks pretty good to me as far as my opinion on what good Lynx Palomino color should be. Now we take it outside, take it in the better light over on the show hall, I might change my mind a little bit, but we've got a nice even shade. That medium pearl gray surface color I think is showing off nicely here, and evenness. Evenness is a big key factor on either of our varieties of Palomino, but I think the Lynx has a harder time with it as far as getting that. Let's see. faults on Lynx, blue or black tipping on the surface, which is kind of interesting. Black tipping, you shouldn't be able to have that. This is a dilute animal, whether you call it a lynx or a fawn, this is a dilute animal, so an actual true black tip color shouldn't be there. But the blue, that's interesting too, because even though we don't say this is a lilac or blue base in the standard, it's obviously aiming us toward a little bit lighter shade to that coloration with that fault. And I have seen, there's not many of them, but they're floating around out there that look kind of opaly, that look really deep, dark blue, almost have a true ring color to them. That fault is there for a good reason. Let's see. Cut severely for very dark ear lacing on either variety. That's, again, a lot of times people blame crossing of the varieties for getting the lacing on the Goldens, but it happens. It happens. And getting that cleanliness to them on the Golds is a lot harder. And along those same lines, let's see if I made a note for it. Yeah. One more thing that we look for on both varieties is make sure we've got nice clean foot color. We don't have the shadow bars to them. Those white stripy looks across the front. A lot of times we'll see these worse on our more washed out, faded colored animals, but it is a pretty prevalent thing throughout the breed. So those are just some things. Again, not a very organized presentation, but just pointing out some things in the standard that I think are worth the look. Any questions besides Al? Okay.
It's a really vague standard, probably the vaguest in terms of point allotments.
Yeah.
But it goes into great depth about breaking down hindquarter, midsection, and shoulder.
Right.
And that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
But there's no point allotment next to it. So as a judge, do you look to other breeds as models like the California, the Champagne, the New Zealand that break those down as well?
I do, because, and the breeds where we do have that broken down, it's pretty consistent where most, second, third.
It is, yeah.
So yeah, when in doubt, use a breakdown. You got to come up with some logical conclusion as to why you're counting one piece of that puzzle more than the other. And I think, hey, everybody else does it, and you didn't tell us a better way to do it is a pretty good logical reason to do it that way. And you said it's a vague standard. It actually used to be even vaguer.
Really?
2 or 3 standards ago, this really doesn't count for anything, but we had a vote and we changed the color, and last standard I think we took the picture out, which was a very flat, ugly picture. But previously our golden standard said golden wheat color. Well, whose wheat are we evaluating? Depending on how dry or your variations between regions, you're going to have all sorts of colors of wheat. So that's a pretty, I forget how he did it, but Tony Bell actually gave me a really good definition of what he called golden wheat, and I said, that's great, but that's just a really good description of the wheat you see. That's as far as we can get it. And on that vote, just wrap it up, a good kind of we on the standards committee are starting to get votes in from our specialty clubs. Please vote in those. If you're a member, those standards changes I talked about on the Palominos, when we did those, we had 9 people voted that year, and we changed a document that's governing how we evaluate our breed. So whatever breed it is, please vote in your standards change elections polls.
And I just have to give, not that y'all really care, but I just have to give a plug. If anybody's thinking of trying a new breed, after my Holland Lops, this is my all-time most favorite breed ever. They're a great rabbit, fun to raise, beautiful colors. I loved them, and even when I sold mine, they didn't go far. They went to Colette, my best friend. And I happen to know that Mr. Joel Petrus has a soft spot for the Palomino as well. You can do meat pens with them, but in my opinion, which is worth a cup of coffee, they're a great breed, a great breed. Thank you, Mikey. Mr. Alan Messick,